So yesterday, we really kind of introduced, after we got Visual Studio Code set up, we spent a little bit of time working with Markdown. Markdown is a structured document format that lets us, create lightweight pages that look like this, so that has some style and some structure applied to it. Behind the scenes, as we showed when we inspected some of these elements, our Markdown tags are being converted into HTML for the purposes of putting them on a web page, right? So each of these Markdown elements that we learned about yesterday is directly being translated into HTML behind the scenes. Okay. The first technology we're really going to learn and dive into in the context of learning to be web developers is HTML. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So hypertext is the underlying technology. So when you hear of HTTP or HTTPS, that stands for Hypertext Transport Protocol. Hypertext is the name of the format of the structure of documents we're going to learn. What makes HTML special or different? HTML is just a structure format. It talks about what the document looks like structurally. It has nothing to do with how it looks. It has nothing to do with how it interacts with the users. It's merely about saying, this is a heading, this is a paragraph, this is a section, this is an article. Okay? It's about the content of the page and giving it some semantic understanding so that browsers can render that and put the context of that document in ways. We're going to spend a lot of time focused on the browser itself, but HTML is also a great technology because it allows people that are blind or that have vision impairment. They're going to use a screen reader that is going to read the HTML document, and because we've used good tags, it's going to say the title of this page is this. The screen reader is actually reading this out loud to these users with visual impairment, because the structure of the document is all controlled with HTML, and the tags and elements that we're going to learn are how we define the structure of that document. There are a bunch of other markup languages. For those of you who continue it down academia, there's what's the name of that one that they use for? There's another language called YAML, for example, which will probably you might get exposed to for it's used pretty frequently in configuration files for libraries. YAML stands for yet another markup language. So programmers are always coming up with clever little acronyms for ourselves that just kind of a part of the inside joke. But HTML is by far the most ubiquitous of these types of languages. Now, you'll notice that it says markup language and not programming language. And the reason for that is because a markup language is really just about defining the structure. When we learn JavaScript later on in this course, JavaScript is a programming language, and the major difference between the two is that a programming language contains control elements, right? A control element is like letting us choose between two values, right? So we say if a variable equals Eric, then do this, right? So a programming language by its nature is always going to have control elements. Markup languages, whether it's YAML or HTML or any of the number of other markup languages that have existed, they're all about just the structure of the output, right? A PDF file, for example, has a markup language to it, even if that markup language is binary, right? So a PDF file, if you ever open it up with Notepad, it's got a whole bunch of gibberish. That gibberish is still a markup language telling the Adobe Acrobat file, where to place titles and where an image goes on the page, right? All of that is structural elements that define that document. Microsoft Word has its own document format behind the scenes as well. But what made HTML such a powerful technology and why it took over really the whole planet, right? Everything is a web page these days, is because A, it was completely text-based, and B, it's a free and open language. It's fairly simple to learn, though you can spend 20 years. I'm still learning things as we go, right? It's always evolving. It's always getting better. And the browser technology, the fact that HTML is combined with languages like JavaScript and is combined with a network technology like HTTP means that you can write one piece of code that can be shared with anyone in the world for relatively low cost, right? So, in the olden days, way back when I first started writing software, if I wanted to get my software into the hands of my users, I would print it on. I'd have to burn it onto a CD. I'd have to deliver it to them. We'd ship it in mail, or it would be on like 40 or 50 floppy disks. That used to be how we distributed software. And with HTML and HTTP, we now have this technology that, everyone's got a browser in their computer. If you go to a website, you're getting some application delivered to you. And HTML, without fail, behind the scenes, is the structure of the output that is coming to you. Okay? So what is HTML made of? At its core, HTML is just a bunch of elements that mean things, right? So we learned yesterday that in Markdown, if you use a pound sign, that means it's a heading, right? Well, there behind the scenes, there is a heading tag or a heading element that is called H1 through H6, right? So H1 is the biggest possible element, and H6 is the smallest possible element of that. A paragraph tag in HTML is going to be a P, right? So it's this very simple structure that lets us quickly and easily compose documents that can be easily shared and viewed by anyone with a browser. Okay? And we're used to using browsers like Google Chrome and Firefox and Safari, but browsers have been around since the 90s, right? It started with Mozilla, and even before then, Mosaic was really the first internet browser, and they all were using this fundamental technology of HTML to share content over the internet. Okay, and so as the browsers continue to get better and evolve, we've gotten things like tabs now. Tabs used to not be a thing. In the 90s, when I first got on the internet, when we were using Internet Explorer, anytime you wanted a new web page opened, you had to press Control-N and open a whole new window. And so you'd have a menu bar at the bottom of your page that would have like 40 or 50 windows open. Okay, but now we have tabs. So these things are constantly evolving and getting better. HTML, all of these elements, so I often, probably incorrectly, use the words elements and tags interchangeably just because they are very similar in what they do. An element in general refers to the entire content of a single element, right? So when we talk about a paragraph tag, it's the tag itself, which is a P, but it also means it's the element that is contained within it, right? So it's going to contain the text of that document, of that paragraph, any attributes that go along with it, which we're going to look at here in a minute. An attribute is something that is descriptive of the tag, right? So the element is all encompassing of the entire tag and the elements and the attributes, but because I'm kind of old-fashioned and it's hard for old dogs to break bad habits, I call things tags and elements. Those are interchangeable to me, but just know that at a big picture, an element is the entire thing, and a tag is really just the actual letter P or the actual letter H1 with an angle bracket. We're also going to take a look at the concept of self-closing and closing elements. In HTML, HTML is very similar to another markup language called XML, right? That's another one that I couldn't think of off the top of my head. XML is extensible markup language. It's going to look almost identical to HTML, but it's the same type of markup language where you've got a word or letter or a series of numbers, and it has angle brackets, so less than sign and a greater than sign. So I'm sure you guys have I'll just type one here, a P. This is a P tag, right? A paragraph tag. So on the topic of self-closing is that a lot of these documents make the assumption that this is a hierarchy, right? So, if we put our paragraph inside this P tag, the browser or the rendering engine knows that the paragraph is over when it reaches a closing tag. So the entirety of the element is this entire block of a paragraph. The other cool thing about this technology is that our elements can contain other elements, right? So when we were looking at yesterday about making something italic or bold, there is a tag called strong that says, hey, make this bold, make this emphasized. And so whatever is wrapped inside of a strong tab is going to be bolded, but all of that is contained within the paragraph element. Okay, this is an element of its own, the strong tag, the strong element, but that element can be inside other elements. You understand? Now there are some elements that are specifically defined in the HTML specification as being self-closing. And what that means is that most of these tags require a tag at the end to say this paragraph is over now. Now I'm going to go on to a different element. Some of our tags are going to be ones that don't require an ending tag. So common ones that come to mind, like a link tag. Right? We're going to use those to link to style sheets when we start learning about CSS later next week. Those tags basically just say link, relativity is style sheet, and the href, the link to that style sheet, is this address. And that's all that tag needs. It doesn't need a closing tag. It is self-closing. And there are a few of those. For the most part, if you were writing HTML and you don't know if something is closing or self-closing, requires an end tag or doesn't, 99.9% of all the tags you're ever going to write they require a closing tag, because most tags, most elements have the assumption that there's going to be some content inside of it. Some tags, some elements that we are going to use are self-closing because they assume The element itself stands alone. One that you will probably use pretty often that is self-closing is input tags, right? So when you say, I need to get a username or get an email address, right? You're going to use an input tag to capture that information on the page. Those tags are standalone. They're self-closing. They don't need a closing tag. Okay. Pages also have a title. A title tag or a title element often goes in the structure of the document that describes the document, right? So when we start looking at some lightweight HTML, the title is what is creating this information up here at the top of the page on the title bar, right? So the title is outside of the scope of the document. If you think of the document as like everything inside this white area is the HTML, there are some elements that let us control things that happen outside of the HTML. So like this favicon is one of those examples, right? The page itself is defining with the link element that there is an icon that goes with this web page. So each of these web pages get a different icon defined in the HTML document, but kind of outside the scope of the page, of the content, and the title is one of those as well. HTML has a document structure, and so maybe now is a good time to let's start exploring some of the things that we do in HTML. And I'm gonna start this kind of how we did Markdown yesterday, and we will start from. I'm gonna create a new GitHub repository, and we'll go from there. Code Bootcamp 13. Let's go there. All right. So I'm gonna create a new repository, and I'm gonna call this first HTML practice. Right. I'll make this public so you guys can read it. I'm going to add a README, a get ignore. I don't need a license, that's fine. And I'll just say node. Good. All right, and I'm going to pull this down so we can start working. Okay. Pull up a new window. All right. Oh. Let me clone this repository first. I'm going to run git clone and include that thing. So now I have my HTML practice folder that we'll use as our project. All right, HTML. Wait. Oh no, I put it in my home directory. What did I do this? Move HTML practice to CBC13. Move is a command that we didn't talk about in the when we were learning the command line interface, but it's a really good one, right? It's going to basically move this entire directory to a new location, right? So it's going to move this HTML practice into this new location. So if I type this, now when I go into CBC13, it should be there, right? And now I can, yeah, it popped up immediately behind the scenes. So I'm going to select that folder. All right, cool. So I'm going to make an HTML page, index.html. Good. All right. So all of our HTML pages should start with this. This is called a document type declaration. Okay, let me make this a little bit bigger so you can see better. And a document type declaration, it's one of those things that is, it's not required. Your web page is not going to break without it, but it's a good practice to have. And it's telling it that for the browser or the rendering engine that is looking at this, that the type of this document that is going to come after this is HTML. Okay. There's a whole bunch of other document type declarations. Way back in the day when I was, when I first got started in the late 90s, early thousands, we had document type declarations that were all kinds of crazy, like XML, HTTP, 4.0, like that defined, hey, the document that I'm giving you follows the XML or the XHTTP 4.0 specification, so that the browser would know when I render this page, I want to use this set of rules so that the H1 tag looks like this instead of looks like that. All of that has been simplified recently so that almost all the time, all you ever need to do is just put doc type HTML, okay? And I'm going to show you some shortcuts that will help us so that you don't have to remember to type all this stuff in all the time. This is boilerplate, essentially. And so we don't need to do this every time. You don't need to remember that this doc type declaration is important. And when you use this boilerplate to build your projects, it'll just exist. And you just say, okay, well, that's the document type declaration. Okay? Now, the very next thing that happens after the doc type declaration is we have our first element that is super important, and that is the HTML element. Okay? Everything on a web page will happen between the start tag and the end tag of HTML. Okay? If you type in a bunch of stuff down here like H1 hello, okay? Now, unfortunately, browsers are very good at dealing with bad HTML. There are millions and millions of web pages that have very broken HTML, and so browsers have gotten to the point where they say, this is valid HTML up here, and this is invalid HTML, but I still am going to render this. Okay? It's not valid HTML. Having this h1 outside of our HTML element is wrong, but your browser, if we were to pull this up right now, let's see if we go live with this. Go live. Open with live server. Good. Yeah. This HTML, if we view page source here, you can see that the h1 is outside of our HTML. That's invalid, but it rendered still. You can still see it says hello. And I would be willing to bet, let's inspect this page. Yeah, so it has the HTML tag, it has the head tag, which we're going to talk about next. Then it has the body, and if we open up the body, it put that h1 inside of our body, which we're going to see, even though it's invalid and even though the source code says this h1 is outside of our body. The browser was smart enough to realize we were trying to do something wrong, and it kind of fixed it for us. But this is a very dangerous behavior to do. You shouldn't rely on writing bad code, because not every browser is as nice as this. You could put this h1 tag in here, and if you're on an older version of Safari, or if you're on a mobile phone, this might not ever show up, and you'll spend all your time scratching your head being like, it works on my computer, why is it not working on my customer's Android machine? And it's because you wrote incorrect code, but the browser that you're using was extra nice to you and ignored it. Okay, so where are we at here? Perfect. So the HTML document, these tags, everything between here is the valid center of the page, right? So we were talking about the title bar and all that stuff earlier. Everything kind of from the bottom of my little bookmarks bar down to the very bottom of the page, right? I got this little widget here. Everything in this white area is the page. It's the document itself, and that's what's inside this HTML page. This is like the body, okay? Now, we were talking about the title tag. Inside the HTML element, almost always the very first element that you're going to have inside of that is the head element. And the head element is one of those special ones because everything we put inside the head is not going to be rendered inside this page. Okay? What we put in here inside this head element is meta information about the page. So the first one we were talking about is title, right? You'll notice that on this page, if you look at my title bar, it's just showing you the name of this file and on the server I'm at, my local IP address /index.html. But if I put in here and I say title, my first web page, right? And I close this title tag, I'll take out that period because that's going to drive me crazy. As soon as I save this, I'm going to do file save. You'll notice behind the scenes, if you watch this tab, because I'm using live server plugin for our page, as soon as the code changes, this page is going to reload and you're going to see that title pop up there. File save. If we go to here, oh, it didn't reload, that's annoying. But it did change the thing to my first page. I don't know why it didn't reload. Maybe because I had broken the HTML or something. Okay, and now if we view page source, you can see, that's the thing that's supposed to be reloading everything. I don't know why it's not working. Anyway, this is being inserted by our plugin, the plugin in Visual Studio Code. You're going to see this at the bottom of all your pages when you're developing with Visual Studio Code. If you're using this live server plugin, this is JavaScript, but it's not, oh, I know why it's not working. So this is a great example, right? It put this script tag inside of our head, and so it's not running correctly. But we can see that it starts with our doc type declaration, and then it's got our HTML tag, then our head, then our title. Okay. Other things that go in this this head are things. Here, I'll document this as we go. So we'll say I'm going to use a comment, right? So this is a comment in HTML. If I put it's a special type of tag, and it goes ! dash, and then it closes with dash greater than. So anything I put in here is a comment. It's not going to be rendered anywhere. It's not going to be displayed to anybody, but it will still be visible in this in the source code if I save, right? So you can see that this comment is in here and it's visible to our users, but it does not show up on the page anywhere. Okay, great. So more things that we will put inside of our head is style sheets, okay, and script tags. Right? We're going to learn about style sheets next week for sure, and we're going to learn about JavaScript kind of going into week 3, where we're going to, this is the place you would put those elements. And I'll just, for the sake of just showing off what they look like, we were talking about a self-closing tag earlier. the style sheet link tag is what does that for us. So we would say link rel equals style sheet, href equals, and it would be like a CSS style.css. Okay, this tag does not need a closing tag. Okay, it's self-closing, and so right now it's trying to link to CSS style.css, and if I was to come over here and view this page, I click on this link, it's going to take me to a 404 page because I don't have that file on my server, and my server is this project. If I was to make this folder, right? So I'm going to make a folder called CSS, and inside of that folder, I'm going to make a file called style.css, and if I just put like a background color, let's do body background color. Let's make this medium sea green or something. Yeah, good. Cool. So now that file exists. So when I look at this page now, the background of this page is green, because that link tag, when the browser is reading through these rules and it says, okay, the title of this page is my first web page, and it puts it up here. Then it goes to the next line and says, I'm linking to a style sheet. It goes behind the scenes and makes a request to get that file to pull in those rules to tell it how to style this page. Okay? So that's another thing that goes up here in the head. Another thing that goes in the head is our script elements, right? So when we start writing JavaScript, we're going to be using script tags, right? And a script tag looks just like this. A script tag is not self-closing, right? So script tags can be used a number of different ways. The way you're probably going to use it inside of a head, right? Because a script tag does not have to be in the head. But when we put it in the head, it's almost always going to be with a source attribute, where we'll say, I want it to load this external file, script.js. Okay? And so most of the time when you're seeing a script tag in our head like this, it's going to look kind of like this. This is kind of the default way that this will be displayed. And so that's going to do the exact same type of thing that the link tag did, right? Our source code is going to get to this line. It's going to say, hey, this is a script. I need to pull in this script, which right now says nothing, okay? And if we were to reload our page, like nothing happens. The page didn't break. But behind the scenes, if we were to look at our network log here, when we reload the page, you can see that the first thing that's loaded is index.html. Then it tries to load the style.css, which it did, and it took 3 milliseconds to get that in. Then it tried to get script.js, and it shows up as red because that was a 404. 404 is a status that means the file was not found. Okay, but the same thing applies here, right? We'd said this script is located at /js/script. So if I make that folder, JS, and I make a file inside of that, and I say script.js, if I was to come in here and say alert, hello, right? Now when I run this page, as soon as the page loads, it alerts hello, okay? Because that file exists now, right? And every time I load this page, it's going to alert me and say hello. Okay? So that's most of what you're going to put in the head. There are a bunch of other head-specific attributes that we'll probably talk about as we get further into development that are just not that important to focus on right now. We were talking about like favicons, right? That's done with link rel equals, icon, href equals, favicon.ico, right? So something like that. If I had that image there, then instead of this default little globe icon that the browser gives us, it would replace it with, a little picture that I provide. So all of the content of our web page that we want to display, structurally, is defined in this HTML document. Right, so I'm going to take this out right now. I'm going to wrap this in a comment. Right, and so we can, in HTML, I've got this commented. It's not going to, the browser's not actually going to run this line of code. So you know how this has been alerting every time we load this page? Because we have this script tag in here, I can simply comment this out, and now, the code is still there behind the scenes, but the browser is not going to run it. Right? You see how it shows up as a different color green? Now this is no longer cares about this content. It's still there. This is not a safety measure. You commenting something out because you don't want your users to see it. They can still view the source and see that there's stuff in here. So I wouldn't put usernames and passwords or anything in there. That's not gonna do anything. But it does keep the browser from trying to do anything with this. Okay. So what else? So that's the head. Okay. and the head element exists within the HTML element and goes from the start of the head down to the bottom of the head. And think of the head as like, this is like the heading, right? The information about the page that isn't in the page. Okay? The next attribute, or the next element, right? So this is our head. The next major component, and this is going to be present in all of these web pages, and you saw when we were looking at that we put that H1 in our page to begin with, and we went and inspected it. There was a body tag, and the body tag is really where all the fun happens. This is the structure of the actual document that you're showing to users. And so it starts with body, and it ends with body. Every single thing in here, all of the stuff in here is displayed to the users, for the most part. Okay. So you can see that by default, this has put that text in this page. Okay. And if we inspect our HTML, right, we now see we have an HTML element. Then it has a head, which is where all of our meta information is going. Then we have our body, and then it just has an empty string here that says all of the stuff in here is displayed to our users. This text content in here, the browser doesn't know what to do with it, so it's just displaying it as text. It's not inside of a paragraph. It gets no special formatting. It just says you have this body element and it has text content, so just show it. Okay. So yesterday when we were playing with Markdown, let me see if I can pull up that Markdown practice. Close this. Markdown, right. We were talking about all the basic structures of our page, right? So we had a bunch of headings, a bunch of bold tags, we had quotes, block quotes, unordered and ordered lists. So let's just recreate all that functionality with HTML, right? So yesterday we learned that Markdown, a pound sign is a level 1 heading. Level 1 heading, right? That's the biggest. Well, in HTML, the level 1 heading is H1. It starts like that and it ends like that, right? All of our closing tags are always going to look at whatever the tag was to begin with a forward slash in front of it, right? So anything that goes in between these two tags is going to be treated as level 1 text. So as big as it possibly can be, okay? And that's just the default style. When we learn about CSS next week, and we can even play with this today just to like show off how this is all done, all of the things that are happening in your web page, if you don't provide style sheets, is just the default behavior that the browser is, like 30 years ago, they came up with this default styles where they're like, a level 1 heading should be, 32 pixels tall and whatever. Like, those are behind the scenes, those are being set, and we'll show off how that works here. So, level 1 heading, okay? And if I take out this, right, and I reload our page, you can see now I have a level 1 heading that is pretty big size. And if I look at this level 1 heading, you can see that this is the user agent style sheet. We're going to learn about the console and how to understand and navigate our way around here. But this is those default styles I was telling you. So there is CSS behind the scenes saying that when I see an H1 tag, apply these styles. Make the font size 2EM, which we'll learn about. It's got a margin to the left. It's got some font weight bold. Those are all default styles. Okay. What else? So, what are some other heading levels that we learned about yesterday? Or who thinks they know what comes next? Karif.
Would that be H2?
Yeah.
Or are we making a paragraph?
No, H2 is perfect. So let's just focus. We're going to go kind of section by section and explore our way through this. So level 2 heading. Right? H2. Perfect. And you can see it goes right below it. And it is in H2, and it's a little bit smaller, right? So it's kind of similar to Markdown, right? It's not as clean. Markdown is just a bunch of like symbols, right? When we were looking at a Markdown yesterday, this was like level 1 heading, level 2 heading, right? This is a cleaner, like easier to type, easier to just read if you're reading this document. Especially when you start working on bigger HTML documents, these tags are going to get crazy. They're going to be tags nested inside of tags, and everything's going to go kind of wild. But fundamentally, it's doing the same thing. It's the same type of concept, and that's what it's really important to understand. So then, as I'm sure you guys can imagine, I'm not going to make you answer it. Level 3 heading, right? H4, level 4 heading. H5, level 5 heading. H6, level 6 heading. H6. Okay. And if we look at them, it's going to look kind of similar to what it looked like on GitHub. It goes from biggest to smallest. Okay, and it's interesting to note, I think level 6 heading is actually smaller by default than our paragraph tag. So let's write a paragraph in here right now and just take a look at that, right? So we'll say, paragraph. This is a paragraph. Yeah, and so you can see paragraph kind of looks like, to me, just at a glance, it's probably about the same size as the level 4 heading. Maybe we can verify this. All right, so the paragraph tag has it doesn't even have a font size defined. Okay, yeah, so a level 4 heading doesn't have a font size defined either, so they're both using the default font size, which is probably like 12 pixels or something, or 16, depending on my computer, because I'm already kind of zoomed in already, right? So cool. So paragraph and a level 4 heading by default are going to be about the same size, but they semantically mean different things. Remember, we were talking about this as being structural, and it's because if someone comes here with a visual impairment, their screen reader is going to care about these headings because it's going to segment their screen reading experience by topic. So they'd come to the page and it would say, "You are at the web page of my first web page. It has major section of level 1 heading and a subsection of level 2 heading with a bunch of paragraphs in between it." So they can control their screen reader by the sections and headings that are defined. Okay, so that's a paragraph. We learned about that yesterday. What other markdown elements did we learn about that we want to explore their HTML counterparts?
Italics, boxes.
Yeah, great. So italics, some of those structural elements that says to make this strong, to make it bold, to make it italic, to make it underlined. This has gone through a few iterations. I'm going to give you a tiny little bit of history just to let you know, this is how it was crazy before and how it's gotten a lot better today. Way back in the early days of the internet, in the 90s, there was no concept of style sheets. Everything was HTML, and the document itself was expected to provide style information to the browser. And so a lot of our early tags were around style stuff, right? So prior to them being structured, right, the tags themselves that provided that information was more around what it was supposed to look like rather than what it meant. Okay, and so if I have a paragraph and want to make something italic, I can use the I tag, right? And so the original way to make something italicized was to use I, right? As I'm sure you can imagine, it means italic, right? And so if we were to save this and reload our page, yeah, you can see that I tag is italicized. As we've evolved, as this programming language has gone to be, as they've changed markup language here to mean this is the structure of the document, this is what you're supposed to think about these elements, we've drifted away from using tags like I or like bold, right? Because the other one would be if I want to make something bold, I could use the B tag, right? So B, bold, okay? You can see that that's bold, okay? This is no longer best practice. You're not supposed to mix the stylistic presentation of your documents with stylistic tags. Now, we want to use the EM tag, EM. And EM stands for emphasized, okay? It's going to look the same way by default, right? It's still italicized, but it's telling any screen reader or any future browser or any future client, I don't care if this is italicized or not. I don't care how you choose to display it. I just want this to be emphasized, okay? And the same way with bold. We don't use the bold tag anymore, even though it still works. We use the strong tag, okay? And the strong tag says, this is strong. I want you to say this aloud. Oh, cool. It's got I clicked a button and it pulled up help information. Let me change that text so that it doesn't lie to strong. Okay. So you can still use I, you can still use B, but that's bad practice. when we're thinking about HTML, we should think about this as the structure of our document, not what it looks like. We're going to learn how to make it look a certain way when we really start diving in deep into CSS next week. But what we want to do is we want to tell the client in this case is the browser, or if you're on a mobile phone, it's the browser of your phone, or if you're visually impaired, it's your screen reader. We're telling the client that this is to be emphasized and this is to be made strong. Okay. We also have a tag. We didn't really play with this. There is a markdown equivalent, and if you want to say, hey, this has been deleted or this has been struck through. Let me think. This is deleted, right? So we used to have a tag called strike. I think that should work. And if you reload this, yeah, it's gonna put a line through it. Okay. We also have this is a synonym for the tag delete, right? Del. That's gonna do the same thing. This is deleted. Deleted is probably the better for the same reason. Strike is saying, hey, draw a line through this. The deleted tag tells us what we're doing with it. We're saying this has been removed, but I still want to display it. You're going to often use that for like, if you were working on a terms of service or something, and you're making changes, you might want to say, this was a rule and it has been deleted. So you'd use a del tag. There's specialty use cases for these types of elements and attributes. I use strong pretty often, and I'll use emphasis pretty often as well. But some of these specialty tags like delete, there's probably like 600. Let's look this up. How many tags are there in HTML? Yeah, there's like 100 plus tags. The ones we're going to cover today specifically, the ones you're going to use the most often. There's a bunch of tags like that where some of them exist because they used to exist, and like I and bold, those still are tags. You're just not supposed to use them anymore. All right, so that's paragraph. So the other thing we learned about yesterday is block quote, right? So a block quote was, we were trying to quote Abraham Lincoln, making him talk about the internet. So we could say block quote, hello world, I love cats, right? This is a quotation from somebody, and there's also a citation tag that would generally go with a block quote. Let's see, block quote and citation. So okay, you can cite things in the attribute, okay, and then you can put in this cite tag. Yeah. Oh, what am I doing? Block quote. And so all the block quote tag really does is it, by default, stylistically, when we start learning about CSS, it just moves it in a little bit. But it tells behind the scenes, just like other structural elements, that this is a quotation from somebody else, and I should expect to have an author or a citation to support this. And maybe these need to go inside the block quote. Let's see if that looks better. As you'll notice, one cool thing about HTML, which we kind of touched on briefly yesterday with Markdown, is that it ignores all this extra white space, right? So I can put as much spacing around my elements as I want, and it's still going to treat it as if there's only one line. Right? So what it's doing here is it's collapsing all the white space. So if you have a space, it's going to shrink it down to one space. If you have 10 spaces, it's going to shrink it down to one space, right? And we can put in an example here. If I have a paragraph, I'm going to put all these in here, okay? Whole bunch of spaces. But if you look at, if I have a paragraph and I reload this page, it shrinks it, it collapses down to one. And it's doing that for all of the elements as well. So as much new lines I put in there, it's going to continue to decide what order to structure this document. So when we're writing HTML, it's important to give it enough breathing room so that it's clear to read. So what I often find myself doing is I'll put an entire empty line in between major structural elements so that it doesn't feel so compressed and cramped. The browser's going to ignore all that white space. So this is really just for ourselves so that it's easy and clean to read. Now, if I'm doing a list like this, I would never have a whole bunch of heading elements together. These are all related, so maybe I would keep those all in the same line. It doesn't matter to the browser. The browser is going to apply its style rules regardless of what the HTML looks like in here. And there are a few exceptions to that, and we'll talk about those later today, or probably next week when we get into some of the more complicated elements. But in general, all this white space is ignored, and it compresses down to a single element, right? So if you put 2 new lines, it might replace it with just 1 new line. If you put 25 spaces, it's going to replace it with 1 space. The other thing we did, let's give ourselves a nice little heading element here, because we want to separate all these different sections we're looking at. As we'll say, this heading is called lists. What is one of the lists that we learned about yesterday?
Ordered and unordered list.
That's both of them. You gave
Oh,
away all
sorry.
of the answers, Olivia.
Sorry,
No,
sorry.
You're good. Yeah, so we'll start with ordered list. An ordered list is a special type of element, right? It's going to do some magic behind the scenes. It's going to do some counting for us. But by itself, an ordered list is just a tag or just an element that contains other elements. So the other type of element that it contains is the list item. List item, LI. And a list item is another tag that requires a closing tag. And we say, I like apples, right? All right, well, let's make this an ordered list, right? So we'll say, wake up, LI, drink coffee, work, sleep, right? This is like a day in the life. And so all of those list items have become an ordered list, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. That's all happening through magic. We didn't put any numbers in here like we did with Markdown. The browser is smart enough to say, this is an ordered list. Start counting every list item at 1, and then go to 2, and then go to 3, and then go to 4. So however many list items that you have in here, that number is going to keep growing forever. And so if we give ourselves a little element, so we'll say ordered list, H3. And Olivia gave the answer to the other type, which was an unordered list. Good. And it's the same type of structure, right? So it uses a UL, unordered list, UL, and inside of it goes list items, right? So list item, what we got? 7 pigs, 12 chickens, 13 rabbits. Type 14, that's fine. Right? Ordered list by default is going to show up as dots. It doesn't care about numbers. But you'll notice it uses the same tag, right? This is a list item and this is a list item. They're the same element type. The only difference is the parent container is either an ordered list or an unordered list. Now this is where HTML is both beautiful in its expression because it lets us identify the structure of the document as like a hierarchy, right? These elements are considered children of this element. And the display and design of this page is largely attributed to that relationship. Okay. What else did we learn yesterday? Oh, we did learn, in Markdown, there was a horizontal rule, right? When we wanted to make a line across the page, right? So let's say we wanted to separate our ordered list from our unordered list. This is a tag. I use it fairly often, but these days, most of the time, I'm going to use I'm going to intentionally add a border with my CSS rather than use this element. But this element is interesting because it's the HR tag, and HR stands for horizontal rule. Horizontal rule. And as I'm sure you can imagine, it puts just kind of like an ugly line through these sections, right? And so these HR, by default, like you notice, this is gray. It doesn't look good. Even on the page, like this font is a bad font choice. The default styles for your browser are generally pretty bad, right? But the good news is when we start learning CSS next week, all of these things are overwritable. Every single style element on this page is controlled with CSS. If we were to go look at the most beautiful website in the world, it is HTML behind the scenes. And it's all styled with CSS. Next week when we start learning CSS, I'm going to show you there's a really cool project that has been around since like the early 90s called CSS Zen Garden. And what that program does is they made this HTML template, and then every author around there's hundreds and thousands of authors now have changed the look and feel of that page just using CSS, even though they all use the exact same HTML to structure the document. So the horizontal rule is here. Now, we could have just as easily come through here and said, add a border of 1 pixel wide at the bottom of this page instead of using the horizontal rule. But remember, when we talk about HTML being a structural language, sometimes you want to tell the client, that I want to have a separator in here. A border applied in CSS visually puts in a separator, but this lets us know, if I was writing a book in HTML, for example, this might be the separator between one chapter and the next. And so it's telling us information about the content. So we learned about heading tags, we learned about paragraph tags. There's another tag that you're going to use over and over and over again. It's an element that doesn't mean anything. It's the div tag. And what the div tag is, it says this is a division of content. Now, by default, it doesn't display anything. If I reload this page right now, you see there's no extra content in here. But what a div tag is, it lets us put content inside of this tag and then control where that information goes, based on our CSS rules. So it's basically just a division of content. So we can put a h2 info inside div tag, right? And then we can put this is a paragraph inside a div. Right? So you're going to use div tags probably more than any other tag in the entire history of HTML, because these are very structural, foundational elements that we use all the time in web development. And you're often going to, for the needs of CSS, when we get into styling, you're going to have div tags wrapped inside div tags, right? So you'll have a div that's like this, right? Div. Right? And this top div might be like, your ID of content, and this one is the ID of, a card, right? And so a div is a very handy element to just say, like, this is some structure of content that I'm going to style for you, but the element itself doesn't mean anything. So when we were talking about the structure of HTML documents, div doesn't really mean anything on its own other than saying, this is some kind of content that I'm going to move around under structure. But just please know that this div exists so that when I tell you to style something, you can attach it to this element, right? We might put a border around this content element, and then we might change the background color of this card element. So we can have divs inside of divs all the way down. Okay. Let's see. What else do we got here? Structure. Yeah, we got that. Good. We've kind of talked about live server. Any questions about any of this that we've covered so far? Go ahead, Olivia.
Do people still use the BR tag to make it go to the next line?
Sometimes, and
Okay.
I'll admit that I use it probably more than is good for me. BR tag is one of those tags that has kind of fallen out of favor in that it's kind of like the HR tag. So the BR tag, for example, here I'll show you. This is a paragraph, right? BR. I'm going to put a BR there, and it stands for line break. And if we reload our page here, if I have a paragraph, that's the line break, and I want to make something italic, I use the M tag. The problem is this line break. Manually putting in line breaks like this does two things. A, it's putting in stylistic information into your page structure, which is generally a bad thing. And B, it has a tendency to start causing pretty significant issues when you start working on mobile or responsive design. So you want it to look good on a big monitor, and you want it to look good on a little tiny Android phone or iPhone. When you start putting structural elements like this in your code, it causes some issues. I still use them pretty occasionally. Like when I'm doing development, I don't spend as much time into HTML as in like the back-end languages and stuff. But what I will often do is I'll maybe, if I'm already in the HTML and I know I want a line break, or I want to like see what the spacing would look like if I move things to other lines, I'll put in a couple BR tags, look at the page, see what it looks like. Right? I may come in here and say BR. And I'm just trying to get a sense for like structurally what should it be, and then I'm going to go and take those out and do it the correct way with CSS. So it's a tool in your tool belt. It's still there. It's still a valid tag, but it doesn't really have a place in modern web development most of the time. And there are exceptions to all these rules. So a great example of that is when we were learning Markdown the other day. remember we were making that list, and it was it was like the block quote, and I said I wanted this haiku to have 3 separate lines, and so the way to do it in Markdown is you hit space twice. It's literally replacing those 2 spaces in Markdown with a BR tag. So there are still parsers, like Markdown parsers and things like that are doing that work for us. They still rely very heavily on that tag. Just depends on the circumstances. Most of the time, I mean, so like to give you some context, right? Like you generally don't want to manually put in line breaks because the thought is that if it's supposed to be a distinct line or a separation, there's probably a better tag, or maybe it needs to be in its own paragraph tag. Because by default, a paragraph tag, if I have a paragraph, right, and I type, okay, and let's close this out, right, I can take out that BR and replace it with a second paragraph tag. So now these are 2 paragraph tags. The paragraph, by default, if I reload this page, right, gives us some visual separation between those lines. But now the browser knows this is a paragraph, this is a paragraph, this is a paragraph. Whereas when it gets to a line break, it just says, put it on the next line, which may or may not be what you want. Especially when the page starts doing wonky things when you start getting different sized windows. You notice how all the text is flowing as my page starts changing directions. So where was that? Our other, yeah, so I can use the EM tag and then I put a line break in there. This is an example of how it acts wonky. I can use the EM tag and that's that line break. As soon as I shrink down, right, now I've still got a line break there and I've lost the original meaning of where I was trying to separate that line. So now it has flowed poorly. Good question. Yep, the BR tag. It's still a good tag, and you will still use it occasionally. But when we're setting up our HTML pages and we're setting up structures, it's probably the wrong tool for whatever you're trying to do most of the time. Okay. Another tag. This is a good one. Let's see if we can pull up our. I'll just steal it from here. Copy the image address. So another tag we're going to use pretty often is the image tag, IMG. The image tag is a self-closing tag, and it has a number of attributes that are pretty important, and we'll talk about those when we learn about attributes and things. But the main one is you're going to put in a source. Okay, source says this is where this file is located, and it's going to expect to get a URL. So this is getting it from camo.github user account. I just right-clicked on the image and copied it in, and then I close the tag. Right? I don't need to give it a /image. It is a self-closing tag. The tag itself contains all it needs to be an image. It expects there to be no content. There's no text content that goes inside of it, so there's no need for a /tag. But if I save this page right now, I should. Yep, there's a giant cat, and that cat is too big. So I'm going to add an attribute that says height equals 20%. Right. So this is an attribute. And attributes go inside of tags, and they say height equals whatever, style equals whatever. Like, so it's always going to be something equals some string value. And like source is an example of an attribute. We're going to spend, after we come back from our next break, we're going to spend a little bit of time dissecting the structure of tags and elements. But for now, I just want to make this a little bit smaller if I can. That's not going to work. Let's do style equals width. 20%. Make this smaller. There we go. Now I've got a small little cat. Cute. What else? Image, we covered that. Okay. Yesterday we were talking about if you wanted to have some code or something display as like a block of code. We do have a few types of those, right? So there's a code tag, and if I put alert equals hello, right? This is not, so this is like valid JavaScript, but it's not going to run as JavaScript because I'm using the code tag to say this content is supposed to be interpreted as code. I'm trying to show this to the user as code. We were showing that off yesterday in our GitHub. And so all the, oh gosh. Why would that do that? Oh, I'm just going to put an HR in here so we can have some separation between our code tag. So all it's doing by default is going to change the font. It changes it to a monospace font so that it looks kind of different from the rest of our text. But often what you'll see when we're, if you're ever going to build some tools for nerds, if you're going to build a project management system or any of those types of things, oftentimes you need to have a function to let your users share code with each other. And so you would use a code tag like this to specify that the stuff that's in here is code, that I want to show to our users. Okay. The code tag can also go inside of paragraphs as well, right? So that's why it was. That's why the cat had moved up to the top. We'll talk about block level versus inline elements next week when we get more in depth into like how we structure and style our pages. But I could also have gone into this paragraph in here and said, and here is some code function. Hello. And the difference here is code is an inline element, which means it's not going to control, it's not going to add line breaks like a paragraph tag does or an H1 tag does. So this would be one of those scenarios, Olivia, to answer your question, where if you were trying to make like a code editor online or something like that, you might have to use BR tags so that you can display, this was supposed to be an extra, let's show that off. So that, we actually want to say this is, 2 lines of code. Alert. Hello. Right. So now you can see that this function, has some extra space in it. All of those use cases, I mean, almost everything we're going to teach you in this class, especially, as Leah kind of brought out today, is there's about 1 million different ways to do things, and they're all right some of the times, right? We're just trying to teach you how to think creatively and to express yourself in a way that makes the computer do cool things. It does the things you want to do, but there's lots of different ways to skin a cat, and there's lots of different ways to make things work. Okay. Oh, that little cat's cute. Nobody wants to skin him. All right. It's 5:40. Any questions? Go ahead, Kareem.
Real quick, I saw it was like auto completions popping up while you were typing. Is that tab or that just naturally pops up?
So some of it, gosh, that drives me crazy. Some of this stuff pops up as you're typing, right? So if I type div, right, as I type D, this is like one of the reasons we choose to use a language like Visual Studio Code, because it knows I'm in an HTML document. It knows what language I'm using, and so it knows what are the valid things for me to type here. So this is like autocomplete or autosense. As soon as you type more, right, if I type DI, now it shows, I could either mean dialog or div or details or data list. So, sometimes you just start typing and it starts working. If you hit enter here, it actually selects whatever is selected. So I'm not, if you type tab, let's see, div, yeah, if you type tab, it'll also autocomplete with whatever's selected. But be careful, because like if I type D, right, it's now selecting div is what I typed last, so it's smart enough to know I probably want to type div again. But when I selected dialog, right, when I went back and typed D again, dialog is selected again. So it's kind of clunky. I'm old school, so I'm gonna, my personal opinion, this stuff gets in my way more than anything else. Like I only turn this on because it's helpful for for entry-level software engineers. I'm a fast enough keyboardist. I know what I'm trying to type, that this stuff gets in my way. And you even see sometimes I'm clicking on, I click on this MDM reference that pops up every once in a while just because I'm like, oh, I didn't mean to do that, right? All that kind of stuff can get in the way, and at some point you'll probably get to a point where you can take the training wheels off and maybe turn off some of that stuff. But I also know some very good software engineers that have been doing this 20 years, and they still, maybe they're not as fast at typing as I am, and they still leave all this stuff turned on. There's no right or wrong answer. You're going to want to eventually, as you get a little bit more experience, and as you start learning your tools a little bit better, you're going to want to get it configured to work how you work more efficiently. There's, again, no right or wrong answer. But, yeah, all this is, a lot of this comes from the plugins we installed yesterday. Good question. Anything else? Oh my gosh, this MDN reference thing drives me bonkers. I click it all the time when I'm just trying to navigate around the page. But it's also awesome, right? If you said, hey, what does this line of code do? You can click here and it pulls up a page and it tells you this is the code element, and it gives you examples of how to use it. Super useful, especially as you're learning. But I already know what this element does, and I click it accidentally 40 times a day. Drives me batty. All right, cool. It's 5:44. Let's take a 15-minute break. Come back at 6, and we'll keep playing. So the other thing we talked about yesterday was, let's give ourselves a heading, and the thing is tables, H2. Right? Tables are another fun, interesting one. It has very specific applications. If you noticed when Leah was kind of showing off some of this stuff for Docket, we had tables of lists of open matters, and you kind of use it as like a navigation element. You can see all the statuses because it gives you nice rows and columns, right? If you think of it as like a spreadsheet, it lets you line up types of information kind of on an X and a Y axis so that you can see visually, that this is data, which is why it's called a table, like a table of data, so that you can view the content, right? When we were learning about this in Markdown, right, we had this Markdown format that was like username, first name, email, right? It was this kind of weird format, and the table syntax in HTML is just as weird and sometimes even more complicated. So we'll cover that after right now. So that was like the Markdown way. So tables all start with a table element, table tag, right? And inside this table tag, there's a bunch of other special tags that we want to know about. The first is there is a TR, and a TR stands for a table row, right? So it's a row of information. So it goes row by row by row by row. And we're going to define it that way from top to bottom. Inside the table row, right, there are two special tags that we're going to use most often, right? If we're talking about the heading elements, we're going to use the TH tag, which stands for table heading, right? So if I was to just replicate this exact same table, I would put username here, close that tag, and I would say first name, right, TH, and then TH email, right? So if we were to look at this right now, stylistically, we should see, let's take this out. Yep. So you're going to see, it doesn't have a bunch of default styles. It used to. Tables used to have a default styling where they put borders and boxes around everything. And we can turn that on, I think, if we use the attribute border equals 1, though I think that's deprecated. Yeah, so this is what they used to look like by default. Now, the preferred way is there's no default style, and the expectation is you're going to style this with CSS. But we'll leave these borders on for now, just so we can see what we're doing. But what you can see here is that by creating a table row, and we're using the TH element, the TH is basically just saying this is a table heading element. The content in here, just make it bold by default. I think that's the default style. But what we do then is we come in here, we add another table row, right? So this is going to be the row below this. And so now what we use is the TD, which is like a table cell element. And so we would say username, ERH, first name. Oh, I closed my tag with a TH instead of a TD. My first name is Eric, TD. My email is me@ericharrison.info, TD. Okay, and that is one complete row. If we save this, you can now see the table has expanded to fit the content that I put in here, right? So me@ericharrison.info was bigger than what we had before, and so the table has kind of grown to encapsulate all that information. But if I wanted to keep adding rows to this, right, we could just keep adding TRs filled with TDs. So I can say, Meg is Meg Harrison Co. Right? And so now you see we got another cell, or another row with cells in it, right? So this is a table. You're going to use this most of the time when you're displaying numbers, when you're working on apps and products. Most of the time this will be like facts and figures, statistics, those sorts of things. Lists of users is a pretty common one. A table is a great way to display tabular data. And when we start diving into databases and building applications with databases, we're going to be building actual database tables that pretty often lend themselves well to being displayed in a table, right? Because it's a table in the database, it's probably valid to be displayed as a table in your product. Way back in the early days of web development, when I first got started, tables before CSS was a thing was how we designed and laid out our web pages, right? So we would do really nasty stuff, and we would say things like, I'm going to define a table, and this is like my heading of my web page, and we would turn off all the borders. And so I'd have like my website name here in this first table cell. Then these two table cells would be the left navigation menu, and these two table cells would be like the content of my page, or I'd have like a blog post in here. We abused the heck out of tables because that was the only way we could separate things and have them line up with each other, Now we can do all this with CSS, and it's gotten very easy. But way back in the day, we abused the heck out of tables, and thankfully that's no longer the case. Now we can use tables just what they were intended for, which is displaying tables of information, tabular data. Okay. And then the other thing that we talked about yesterday is links, right? So if we wanted to link to something, right? So if I wanted to put a link to a page, let's say links and stuff. There's a few types of links to be aware of, but they both use the same type of tag. By default, right? Let's give ourselves a paragraph. I can say, or here, let's use an unordered list. So I'll say UL. And inside my unordered list, I can put in, my website, okay? And the way we link to things, remember when we were doing this in Markdown, it was like the text of the link, and then it was the URL of the link, right? It's kind of backwards, or it's kind of the opposite way in HTML, right? So we have an anchor tag, which stands for A. A is anchor, and the anchor tag has an href, and the href is the URL. So I can say ericharrison.info, okay? And this needs to be HTTPS. Here, I'll make this bigger so we can, right? And then the anchor tag is closed with a /a. And inside that tag is the text that we're going to display as our link. So I can put in my Eric's website, right? And so now we should see a list that says my website. It has Eric's website. And if I click this, it takes me to that page, right? Pretty simple. Okay. Those are most of the things that we learned and covered yesterday with Markdown. So what I think it's appropriate to do, does anyone have any questions about any of this before we start doing some practical exercises? I'm going to save my work and commit it to GitHub so that you guys can see this code and get a reference point, because it's kind of a good overview of HTML. So I'm going to check all my stuff in. I'm going to say initial entry. And I'm going to commit and push. Okay. So now my GitHub portfolio has all those HTML, that HTML file that we created. You can go in here and see what this looks like. I'm going to send this link to y'all. Cool. Then one last thing I wanted to show off before we start doing a little bit of practice. Here's the link in CBC13. I was talking about, like, there's all this boilerplate, like this doc type declaration that you just need to have on all your pages. But structurally, like, it's not important to memorize this necessarily, other than just to know that it has to be there and that it's called a document type declaration. Let's make a new HTML file. I'm going to call this, page2.html. Okay. In our Visual Studio Code editor here, we have this really nice shortcut. If you put in 3 exclamation points, you see that it pops up this like auto completion thing, and if we click it or hit enter, right, it gives us this doc type HTML thing. If I put in 1 exclamation point, it gives us the framework or structure of kind of like a whole page, right? So it's going to give us our HTML, our head, it's going to give us our body, and it's given us like a title and some. So these are some other tags that we'll talk more about in depth when we get to that, but they're like meta information about the page that just tell it like the character set of this page is UTF-8, so we could theoretically use Chinese letters and other foreign language code in here. It's telling you that like the default size of the viewport is full screen, that sort of stuff, and that it's compatible with Internet Explorer and things like that. So none of this is super important. But what is important is that you can just hit exclamation point and then click it, or you can hit exclamation point, enter, and it's going to fill this out. So whenever you're going to go make an HTML page, I almost always just start with this. I don't have to remember all this stuff. I can just come in here and start typing and say page 2, and then I can really get into the body and start working on my page, which is really the only part that anyone cares about, right? These are the types of things that as you get really familiar with your tools, as you start to get a little bit more experience as a developer, this is what makes you look like a wizard compared to your peers. Because I typed 1 letter and it typed out for me, this entire chunk of code. So I don't have to type all this stuff in. I can actually focus on the stuff that matters. And for me, that would be like the H1. This is my second page, right? And then the actual content that we're here working on. This is a paragraph. Okay. Now the cool thing is, now that this project has a second page, right, inside the repository, I can link to this page. Let's come in here and say, li page 2. Right? I'm going to use the anchor tag, href, and I'm going to say page2.html. Go to page 2. Okay? And I close all of my tags, right? If I open a tag and I write more tags inside of it, right, this is all inside the li. And just to make this even clearer, right, like this page 2 is here, and I can split these out on separate lines because it's going to render inside of our page. Remember, because it collapses all that white space, it's going to show up here as page 2 : go to page 2, even though I've given myself some visual separation here to make it really clear what's going on. So structurally, it's doing the exact same thing, but I've given it more breathing room, so it feels less claustrophobic and less cluttered. You should really treat your indentation here and the structure of your documents, and this is going to be really important when we get into actual programming later in JavaScript. You don't want to have lines of code that are a mile long. It makes it really hard to just read at a glance and read and scroll down. So if you ever start finding yourself bumping up against the border of the page, you can add extra white space. Right? All of these things are valid for you to do. The browser doesn't care. It's going to collapse all this stuff up, but now it takes up less space. I don't have to move my eyes as much to read what's going on. But because I put this anchor tag or this link to this other page, right, from this page I can click here and go straight to page 2. That's generally how we're going to build entire websites, is just by creating a page and then linking to that page, so that if you've got a news and about me, all these different pages, they can live on their own separate spot, and you're going to link to them throughout the pages. Okay? Cool. So that's pretty much the basics. Right? There's a ton of complexity in HTML, and we're really going to dive into this very, very deeply next week. It's going to be the major focus of building these pages, styling them. How do we make them all work together? How do we capture user input with forms and things? But I wanted to give you guys just enough to get like your feet wet and start getting comfortable working inside of HTML, so that this is what a document looks like. This is what we're going to be doing for the next 12 weeks. You're always going to be building HTML, even if you're doing it in JavaScript to output HTML. So this is the foundation for everything that we're going to do. So what I want to do now, if there's no other questions, is I want you guys to create a brand new repository, and we're going to make it an HTML portfolio, or whatever project you worked on yesterday when we were doing Markdown. I want you to go and make that exact same document, but now completely in HTML. And we'll take maybe an hour or so to do that. And you can continue to add more functionality if you want, right? We've learned a whole bunch of tags. We've learned a whole bunch of elements that exist, but I want a brand new project, brand new repository, and I want it completely with HTML. And while we're working on that, let's come back at 7:15. If you need a little bit more time, feel free to ask for more time. But let's start getting in the habit of trying to meet deadlines. And so I think within an hour, if you use some of these techniques that we've done, you already know what the content is going to be because you wrote it yesterday in Markdown. Let's convert all of that to HTML. Okay? Any questions? No? Go ahead, Eric.
So what are we doing on Friday?
Friday is not a day of class. Friday is an off day for learning, but we do have office hours. And so if you want some one-on-one education, or you're struggling with something, we have time slots available. I'll show you how to. Let's see if we can get. It's in. Here, I'll copy the link. In our Slack channel, there is a link in the topic that takes you to Calendly, where you can go in and click on the day, and these are the time slots that are open. Obviously, if you need more time, we can increase that. I have found that most problems we can talk through in about 30 minutes or less, and so that's kind of what we start with. But I would encourage you, Fridays, nobody wants to work late on a Friday, so I would encourage you to, if there's a 4 o'clock time available, pick the 4 o'clock. If there's a 4:30 available, pick the 4:30. Don't just jump right to 5:30, because then I have to stick around waiting for that slot. But this is available to you as a resource to get one-on-one instruction of anything you were struggling with, especially as we get later into the course when we start doing some really crazy stuff. But other than that, you have lab time available, kind of 12 to 4, kind of to work on the homework we're going to assign tonight. But other than that, we try to leave your Friday nights open so you can, go to restaurants or spend time with your family.
Okay, yeah, I usually drink on my Friday night, so that's better. But
I'm right
so
there with you.
how do I contact the TAs if I need help?
Just in Slack, just like regular. So we haven't really talked about this. I was planning on getting into it. I don't remember when it came up organically last time. One of the things that we try to do in this class is simulate a real working environment. So we use Slack pretty heavily because most companies that you go to are going to rely very heavily on a chat system like Slack. Okay? And so one of the first things that we encourage is that you start asking questions in public, right? We have our CBC13 channel. It's got all of us in there. When you're at work, when you're working in your day jobs, you're not often going to go and ask the CTO, "Hey, I need help with this problem. Can you help me?" You're most of the time going to say to the person sitting next to you, "Hey, can you help me with this problem? How do I loop through an array," or something like that. So we want to encourage you to start asking your questions in public because one of the other students might have an answer already, and we can keep things at the lowest possible level. Always start your questions in public if you can, unless it's personal or something that you feel uncomfortable with. But get in the habit of just asking your peers first. Try to keep things at the level you're at, and then, once it needs to escalate to the next level, then that's what the TAs are for. And then if it needs to escalate again, that's what I'm here for. And if it needs to escalate again, we're all in trouble because I don't know if there is an answer. Does that make sense? So I have to work tomorrow. I'm on Slack, so you can always ask questions there. And whoever, if you know the answer to it, don't feel uncomfortable jumping in and answering. If Karif has a question on how do I make a heading tag? Well, Olivia knows how to make a heading tag. You can just be like, that's H1 or H2, H3. If you know something, help other people. That's the joy of being an engineer is that we're all good at certain things, and we should all try to contribute into other people and make everyone better around us. Cool. Good question.
All right, thank you.
How did you spin up the server to show your website? I didn't catch that.
Yeah, so when you're on an index.html, I think it only works on an HTML page by default. I only learned about this plugin last year. If I turn this off, right? There is a Go Live button that should be down on the bottom of your blue bar. If you click on that page, it's going to start a server and open up a page. Okay. I also think there's another way you can open with live server if you right click on the file. So it's going to do the same thing, and that's all just because of that plugin we installed. It's running a little tiny web server behind the scenes. It's not a good server, but it's good enough to see what's going on. It's useful. And if it's running, it's going to show down here. It's going to say it's running on port 5501. So if you actually look at the URL here, the IP address of my computer is 127.0.0.1. That's the local address, so it's always going to point to your own computer, and it's on port 5501. So this lets you know it's running. And if you click it, it closes it. So now if I was to reload this page, it should do nothing. Yeah, the site can't be reached. Cool. All right, 6:20. Let's come back at 7:20 and see how we're doing. I'll be here, so if you need help or have questions, I pasted a link to the HTML document that we just built together. And what I want you to do is just try to recreate what you did yesterday in Markdown in a brand new project with HTML. Okay. And don't be surprised if it doesn't look as good as it does in GitHub, because what GitHub is doing is their Markdown is turning their HTML into HTML that has the style sheets of GitHub, so it looks nicer. Yours is going to look probably ugly, and we haven't learned about styling yet, so it's going to be white background and black text, but structurally try to have it be the same.
And all sorts of stuff about love from books that you've read.
Hey, do people still use Dreamweaver?
I don't think so. I haven't heard that name in 15 years.
I know. So when I was in high school, that was my career path, and we learned HTML sort of the same way like you said how you'd get off the chain with tables and making it your navigation. I did that too. So now, like seeing this way, and I feel like that wasn't that long ago. Is just nuts.
Yeah, if I had to guess, I'd be willing to bet Dreamweaver probably still exists, though. It's hard for me to even say. Like, I'm sure people still use programs like that, but I think for the most part, for non-technical people, they just use frameworks like WordPress to be like, I need to add a blog post, and they just click new post.
Mm-hmm.
I know designers still use a lot of Photoshop to like lay out the pages and stuff, but for front-end developers who are actually doing like the implementation of the design, almost all the ones I've ever worked with just type out the HTML and write their own CSS. So
Oh, so yeah, I did have a question that I forgot to ask. When you did your company, did you hire someone to do the?
we pretty much made it through the first week. This first week is supposed to be very introductory. We do a lot of setup and a lot of configuration just to start getting into the mindset of becoming professional software engineers. So as far as I'm concerned, you guys are actually ahead of schedule. It's going much smoother in this class than it did in the last one. Is there anything anybody wants to talk? Go ahead, Selena.
Can I share?
Oh, yeah? You want to show yours too? Let's go.
I did a little something. It was kind of hard because I think I had to go potty the whole time.
Nice. Yeah, we made it through our first full week. Does anyone have any feedback or comments? Have we gone too fast or too slow? This course, each one of these is a little bit different, so we try to tailor it to make sure that we're meeting your needs and setting you up for success. How's the first week been? Go ahead, Creef.
I like the practice break that you give us, the time to work on it individually. You do it, you show us, then we do it. I like that.
There will probably be less of that in the next couple of weeks just because we have to cover so much content. A lot of the practice breaks that it's going to, if you guys aren't like putting in the full 3 to 4 hours during lab time, you're really going to probably struggle. And as you heard from Leah, she was one of the ones who like, at the end of class each night, we used to end at 9 instead of 8. She would work for 3 or 4 hours while it was fresh in her head. I'm not going to tell you when you should or shouldn't work, but we have a ton of content to cover, especially as we get later in the course with JavaScript and stuff. There's also, as we get further along in the course, there's going to be entire days where we're working on projects and working on coding real things together and as a group, where it's going to be most of the day is working in teams. So each week is going to have a slightly different flavor, but I'm glad that you like these practice breaks. It was kind of this class has moved so much faster than the previous one that we covered more of the content. We had a lot of dead space to fill, which is good. You guys are smarter than the last class, so good job. Any other feedback? Any other thoughts? Anything that was difficult or challenging? Go ahead, Olivia.
Is there anything like we could watch or stuff you recommend to try to do more stuff? Because I have free time this weekend.
If you're really feeling frisky, all of the previous classes were recorded as well, so you could watch me talk about what we're going to talk about next week. I hesitate to tell you to like go study things that we're going to do already next week.
For things I could practice that we've already done.
Yeah, you're never going to be wrong. Like the portfolio, it was kind of brought up today and was brought up a couple days ago. That's probably like the one biggest thing where at the end of this course, you should have the world's best portfolio. So starting to think about the content you're going to put on there, even knowing that you're not going to have any projects to show off yet, but maybe you could spend some time researching and thinking through, this is what I want to show on my page to show off my creativity. This is what I want to put on my page, links to resumes, and just starting to put that structural content together for your HTML so that when we start styling it next week and the weeks after, you'll have all the content in place. One of the things the last class struggled with is they had beautiful portfolio pages that they built, but there was no content on it because, it's difficult to write about yourself, and because you have to think of it as like it's a branding exercise. You're trying to show the best version of yourself to the world. Selena, go ahead.
I noticed on Olivia's how she kind of had comments that kind of showed what they were, and then it reminded me of how when we do stuff or when you start a project, to outline stuff in comments so you know what you need to do, like kind of styles that you'd like to see in it, and just like comment it out, and then you can work in those sections and know where you're at. And I need to start doing that because I got off the rabbit trail on mine.
Yeah.
So
That's excellent advice, and we're definitely going to cover that when we get into the programming stuff. But it works just as well for HTML and even things we haven't learned how to do yet. If you can just it's kind of like if you remember back to high school where they're always like, write an outline first before you do a paper, and it seems like, well, I'm just going to start writing. But it's almost always better to write an outline first, even though the advice seems boring and it seems tedious. It's like busy work. If you can think through the logical structure of what you're trying to do first and get it down on paper in the form of comments or even just sketch it out on notepads, then when you go to actually implement, you know exactly what you're doing next, and you can go a lot faster, and it can be more efficient. So I would encourage you over the weekend with all your extra time to think through what you're going to put on your portfolio page as the main thing, and then as we kind of talked about yesterday, you're going to have a lot of opportunities in this class, each of you individually, to start working on projects that are important to you that you can put in your portfolio. And you're going to get put on the spot someday in the future, maybe like on week 3 when we've learned a little bit of JavaScript, and I'm going to say, all right, for the next 3 hours, your project is to build an app that you're proud of. Last semester, Selena was working on like a choose your own adventure type of web page book, and that was really cool. One of our other students built a golf tracker app that he worked on the whole thing. Leah, who spoke to us today, she started working on our blackjack game. So think of start thinking of projects that you're going to want to work on, and maybe even start laying out the rules. Like, it doesn't have to be a game. But think through, like, this is going to be this kind of app. And for Josh, maybe it's a smoking meat tracker where he's going to put like a bunch of recipes, cook times, and whether or not he liked it or not. So start thinking through those interfaces. Sketch them out on paper first, so that when I say, hey, it's time to go build something, you have plenty of things that you're excited to work on. That's what I would start working on first. There's a lot of thinking and a lot of creativity, and the more you think up front, the easier the programming. The coding part is mostly just typing, right? Once you learn enough.
Yeah, I forgot to ask Leah what her typing time is now that she finished your class.
That's next. I'll ask her, and since I'm her boss, I'm gonna make her have work tomorrow of doing the typing test again, and we'll see if there's a difference between her original score and her new score. Cool. What else? Are you guys still pumped up? We made it through 1/12 of the course. You are like 11 weeks away from being professional software developers. It's very exciting. Go ahead, Josh.
I did like how today you released the homework, how you released it last night, just because I'd like to get up and spend more time on it if I have the time. So that was nice having that already. So that way I knew what to do.
All right, I'll keep doing that then. That's easy enough. It's a button click, right? So I can do it tonight or I can do it tomorrow. I just don't want anyone to feel pressured, like you have to stay up all night and work. I'm a night person, so I like to work. I get super creative at night, but some people are morning people, and I don't want anyone to feel like they're getting left out because of time limits or something. So, cool. What else? Is the class everything that you guys thought it would be? Are you learning the things that you thought you would? Do you feel like we're setting you down a path that is leading you where you want to go? Grief? Yeah.
It's a lot easier than I anticipated. I was stressing. I'm not gonna lie, I was stressing it.
It's about to get harder. Yes. No. Literally, like Leah talked about this, every week is harder than the week before it because you have to continue to take the stuff that we learned, and it just keeps building on each other. But everybody will, if you put in the work, you will graduate. And if you put in extra work, you're going to have a really good career. It's completely up to you. But everyone in this group is smart enough to be a software engineer. And if we have to drag you kicking and screaming, I'm going to make sure that I give you as much knowledge as possible to set you up for success. So the only way you can possibly fail this is if you give up or quit. We're like the army, right? Like, if you suck at push-ups, we're going to make you do more push-ups until you no longer suck at them. You're still going to hate them, but you won't suck. Cool. What else? Anything? All right. It's 7:45. We made it through our first week. Tomorrow, office hours for me are between 4 and 6. So if you'd like to spend time going over anything, I know we haven't covered that much yet, but especially as we get later in the course, this time belongs to you from 4 to 6. So schedule time, and we can talk about anything you want. You can just ask questions if you want, or we can, if you're struggling with CSS next week, or if you're having trouble with for loops, it's a completely open discussion time. Last semester or last cohort, I had students who wanted help and feedback on some of the apps they were building. So it's completely up to you. Please schedule time. Don't feel like you have to if you don't have anything to talk about. But I want to encourage you. It doesn't hurt my feelings if you schedule time. I'm here for you. So if there's nothing else, I hope you have a great rest of your week and enjoy your Friday off. And we'll see you back on Monday.